Welcome, everyone. I am Ari Engel, the Director of Creative Community for Peace. Thank you so much for joining us today. Creative Community for Peace is a nonprofit entertainment industry organization comprised of prominent members of the entertainment community who have come together to really do three things. First, to promote the arts as a bridge to peace, whether that is working with Palestinians and Israelis together or building bridges between the Black and Jewish communities here in America. Second, to educate about rising anti-Semitism within the entertainment industry, whether that is doing DEI trainings for entertainment companies or working with digital streaming platforms to better monitor their sites for hates. And finally, to counter the cultural boycott of Israel, where we work with every artist who books to perform in Israel to withstand boycott pressure, everyone from Jennifer Lopez to Maroon 5. To learn more about our work and to support our work, please visit ccfpeace.com. That is ccfpeace.com or creativecommunityforpeace.com. We're glad to have all of you in our public square once again as we present Dispelling the Myths Season 2, a fantastic educational series of conversations with some of the leading experts on the issues and challenges facing Israel and the Jewish people today. In today's conversation, we'll be discussing the threat that is white supremacy. Please feel free to leave questions in the Q&A section of the chat, and I'll try to get to as many of them as possible towards the end of the discussion. This week's guest is Dr. Simon Purdue, who is the Director of Domestic Terrorism Threat Monitor Project and MEMRI. Dr. Purdue received his PhD in World History from Northeastern University, where he focused on the history of race, racism, and violence. He has been a doctoral fellow with the Center of Analysis of the Radical Right, and his forthcoming book, Intersectional Hate, Gender, Race, and Violence on the Transatlantic Extreme Right, explores the way gender has influenced extreme right activism and violence in the United States and the UK. Simon has provided expert analysis on the subject of extremism for a number of media outlets, from CBS, Newsweek, and CNN to Yahoo and the Washington Post, and many more. He has also provided briefings on a variety of extremism-related topics to the FBI, Department of State, the Treasury Department, Department of Homeland Security, and numerous congressional offices. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. So to sort of set the table, just in general terms, what are the trademarks of white supremacists, and what are their general views and goals?
Well, the idea of white supremacy is quite a broad one, and the scope of their beliefs, their forms of activism that they take, is very wide and it's very varied. Generally, though, it can all be boiled down to a kind of core set of ideals. These are the belief that white people are superior to all other races. That's obviously tied into anti-Blackness, more broadly racism, and of course anti-Semitism, which is deeply, deeply ingrained within these various ideologies that make up the broader movement. Many of these groups believe in causing a systemic collapse and building their own ethno-state through a violent racial war, while others believe in using the electoral system to gain prominence and to push through these white supremacist policies, racist ideas at a political or electoral level. So it's a very, very broad scope, but those are the core ideas of what white supremacists broadly believe, both here in the United States and around the world.
Right. So looking at some of the MEMRI materials that I got, your pamphlet on them listed 12 domestic white national extremist groups, from the Proud Boys to the Folkish Resistance Movement. I know organizations many people haven't really even heard about. How many of these groups really are there, and how does their ideology differ?
Yeah, there's dozens and dozens. I mean, within the United States, we're tracking 50 or 60 different named groups within the United States. We've, this is a a field that changes constantly as groups rename, as they dissolve and reemerge. They splinter into multiple different groups as well. So it's a constantly emerging space, or constantly evolving space. And that's just the United States. We have to look outside the United States as well. You've got key sort of hubs for these kind of movements within Europe, in Australia, even in Mexico, and obviously Canada as well. So that's something to really, be cognizant of, is the global nature of this movement. We're increasingly seeing a lot of these groups kind of talking internationally, growing internationally, starting new chapters. We've got American groups starting chapters in Australia. We've got, Canadian groups with, I guess, sister groups in the likes of France and the United Kingdom. So this is a truly global space. And as I said, the number of groups is constantly growing.
Is there any sort of centralized like nexus between them? Is there any sort of over like an organizational body where maybe they get together once a year and meet, or is that not how they operate?
Not so much. I think that the central nexuses that we talk about are actually the platforms that they engage on. The places which facilitate that transnational, international cooperation and communication tend to be platforms such as Telegram, Gab, even nowadays Twitter as well, which are the platforms that allow these groups to communicate and to propagate their hate and their ideology.
Right. So how do these people in general terms are being radicalized? Is it on these platforms where they're sort of learning this ideology of hate, or is it more of a homegrown thing in a local community?
It's becoming increasingly online. Traditionally, we saw the radicalization process happening at sort of radical events, whether it be gun shows or book talks given by extremist authors. But increasingly, we're seeing the online spaces playing a really important role. And while that change is happening, while the increase is happening, the audience that is being exposed to these ideas is growing significantly. We're also seeing younger kids now being exposed to these ideas as well, which is a whole other problem that we're dealing with as younger and younger people are being radicalized. For many of these people, many of these platforms, it's difficult to stumble across them accidentally. But neo-Nazis and white supremacists go on to the more mainstream online spaces and they link to those extreme spaces. They push other users towards those ideas through sort of memes and that kind of meta-political sort of warfare that we're seeing online, and driving younger people and driving wider audiences onto these platforms like Telegram, into these chats, and radicalizing them through that process.
Right. So what are the main outlets? Is 8chan and Telegram? I'm assuming, so you're saying, so essentially saying like they go on 8chan and Telegram and some of these and then try and push them into Facebook and Twitter. Is that what it's looking like?
Yeah, so I think that the biggest platform is Telegram. Telegram plays a key role in all of this. It's kind of the space where neo-Nazis and white supremacists feel most free to express their opinions without censorship and without consequence. But they're also using the likes of 4chan and the now dark web versions of 8chan. As well as sort of more dedicated extremist platforms, dedicated to various subsections of their ideology. We've got a few accelerationist websites that we're following on a daily basis, which are spreading these ideas that we then see going out into those more mainstream places like the Facebook groups, like Twitter, Instagram, even now Snapchat and TikTok, which is a big one as well, and then using those ideas to pull people into those extreme spaces.
Right. And what about video games? I was reading that Twitch, where a lot of young kids, really young kids, spend a lot of their time these days. And even something like Minecraft, I heard there's some sort of infiltration into those. What's happening on those sites?
Yeah, so gaming is actually a really important locus for a lot of these groups. They do see it as an opportunity to speak to a younger audience. I think critically with video gaming culture, memes and edginess, as it's often referred to as, is part of the culture. So it's easier to slip in these ideas, this terminology, these conspiracy theories, and just have the veneer of edginess over the top of it to make it seem less extreme and less threatening. Twitch is a really, really good example. We see a lot of neo-Nazis using Twitch, as well as Steam and other video gaming platforms to go into groups, go into chats, into streams, and spread their ideas. You'll see them posting swastikas, you'll see them talking about ideas like the Great Replacement, and using that to bring people in. Right.
So I just want to read a stat. According to the ADL, more than half of the ideologically motivated extremist mass killings since 1970 have taken place in the last 12 years. So we're seeing a real uptick in this. And right-wing extremists were responsible for all of the extremist-related murders in 2022, with white supremacists committing the majority of them, 84%. So how many people are part of these white extremist groups? And is violence a core part of their ideology?
Yeah, violence is definitely a core element in that ideology. That's something we're seeing on a daily basis, are incitements to violence, threats of violence, particularly violence against prominent individuals. We've seen an uptick in that during the COVID-19 pandemic, with individuals like Dr. Fauci and other public health officials increasingly becoming targets for these violent threats. So we're monitoring that constantly and providing that information to law enforcement when we see it. But this aesthetic of violence is increasingly becoming a problem as well. You see accelerationist groups, some of which you might have heard of, like Atomwaffen Division or the Base, which were in the headlines a few years ago. Groups like these use promotional materials that just exude violence. There's blood splatters, there's weapons, there's skull masks. It's all part of this aesthetic of violence, which is central to how they portray themselves. They want to be feared. And the possibility of real world violence is a really, really important part of that fear they're trying to propagate and that terror that they are trying to kind of encourage. So violence is a very, very central part of this. In terms of the other part,
yeah, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in terms of the other part of your question about how many people are a part of these
Right.
groups, that does vary dramatically. In some of the groups online that we're following, we see, numbers in the thousands. In terms of the real world, it's sometimes difficult to track how many people are a part of them, but there are no shortage of violent neo-Nazis, both online and out there in the real world. And I think that's something we need to be very aware of.
Is there any idea, say just in America, like what % of the population like hold these views? Maybe aren't necessarily belong to one of these white supremacist groups, but hold these sorts of views?
It's very, very hard to put a number on that, sadly, because again, there's issues with not knowing how many are members and how many hold these views. Those who self-report versus those who don't, it's kind of difficult to put a number on it, but there are definitely thousands of active neo-Nazis and white supremacists in the United States who would be members of these groups.
Right. And so you outlined a little bit, but just to talk about their tactics to achieve their goals, you talked about social media, there's militancy. Curious to see like what sort of militancy we're talking about. And is there other tactics, maybe like lawfare, using the courts to try and sue or to change rules and regulations? What does that look like?
Yeah, so that again varies across the spectrum. We have everything from that lawfare aspect, which would be linked more to the likes of the sovereign citizen movement, slightly more organized and political groups who will use the courts, who will use the law to kind of push through their own ideas. In terms of the social media strategy, I mentioned earlier about that mimetic warfare, that kind of meme conflict, feeding into the idea of a culture war is really, really central. We see a lot of these groups, grabbing onto current events, creating, violent white supremacist memes relating to these, whether it be, the likes of Kanye West at the end of last year and his sort of spiral into anti-Semitism. Or, whether it be the war in Ukraine, we're seeing, neo-Nazis use these popular trending topics, if you will, to spread their ideas through memes, through messages, through video content, etc. So they're really actually very, very good at using the internet and using that kind of mimetic warfare to get their message across. We're also seeing an uptick in militancy as well. We saw a decline post January 6th as a lot of groups were somewhat put off by the legal response to January 6th and the prosecutions that followed that. But we're now seeing an uptick as well with the likes of protests at LGBTQ events across the country, not only in the United States, but in Europe and Canada as well. Militant groups, armed groups turning up to those. So that's also something we're tracking.
And so what are social media and tech sites doing to counter this? Are they being active in trying to suppress this stuff? And even for instance, and I would love for you to talk about this, I was reading a report you guys did on the Internet Archive to spread hate. Maybe tell us a little bit about that too. It's a massive online digital library that these groups were overtaking to spread this sort of hatred.
Yeah. So in terms of what social media and tech sites are doing, it really does vary. Some are better than others. And some tend to focus on particular areas. YouTube, for example, has been very, very good at removing jihadi content from their platforms. They have not been as effective with white supremacist and neo-Nazi content. Even within that, there's more of an active approach when it comes to American neo-Nazis and white supremacists, but we find that Canadian white supremacists and European groups, particularly those who communicate in languages other than English, whether that be German or Polish, are the two languages that we focus on there. The YouTube has not been particularly good at removing that content from the platform, and that's something that we've reported on quite extensively. Obviously, within the last 6 months, things have changed at Twitter, which is another, particularly popular one. And we've seen a lot more white supremacist and neo-Nazi extremists moving back towards Twitter in the hope that they might be part of this digital town square that has been talked about with less censorship. Many of them have managed to stay on the platform and have accrued up to 20,000 followers in some cases. While others, broke the terms of service pretty quickly and were removed. So it is piecemeal, and a lot of these companies are they have strategies in place, but it isn't catching enough. We're seeing a lot of neo-Nazis thriving on these mainstream platforms.
Right, and it doesn't. These don't just before we jump on the library archive. So I'm assuming this content and the speech violates the terms of service of these companies, and as we've actually found in our work too. Yes, right, not enforcing them. But in America, you were talking about. So does free speech? I guess the protection of free speech is so strong here that there's no legal aspect. There's no like law enforcement thing that can be done about these, right? Or is there something in the laws that can be done against these groups?
Well, sadly, outside of threats of violence and direct incitement to violence, there isn't much that can be done at the legal level. That sort of freedom of speech element does really come into play, because the freedom of association and the freedom to say, whatever you want within the bounds of acceptable speech is kind of core to this kind of idea in the United States. Outside of the US, that's obviously a very different situation, whether that be Canada, United Kingdom, Australia, where hate speech is prosecuted more readily.
Right.
But for the platforms themselves, that doesn't come into play. Free speech isn't a factor for the platforms. So I think that's where most of the kind of strategy in terms of countering this needs to take place, is at the platform level.
Right. And then, so talking about the Internet Archive, just for people that don't know, there's this massive digital library basically housed in San Francisco where people can upload content, doesn't require any credentials, verification. There's no way to flag or remove like the content. Groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS use it to spread materials. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you were seeing on there, and if anything can be done about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Internet Archive allows a variety of different sort of approaches when it comes to saving content. It allows people to save website pages as an archived copy, which means that if web pages are taken off the internet, they can still exist on the Internet Archive. That means that those sites which have broken laws in the United States through threats of violence or through violent content can remain active, or at least visible through that website. So we're seeing a lot of neo-Nazis, particularly the more violent accelerationist neo-Nazis, saving their sites either preemptively or obviously after they've been taken offline on the Internet Archive. So there's a real danger there in terms of the continued propagation of violent content. Similarly, it allows uploading of content. We've seen how a number of mass shooters and white supremacist terrorists, such as the Highland Park shooter from last July 4th. He used the Internet Archive to host a lot of videos and photographic content as well. So that it's used very, very extensively by extremists, because, as you say, it's not easily monitored. It's not easy to flag something or take it down unless you go directly to the company, and usually that needs to be done through legal means, as they're fairly unwilling to take down content without being pushed to do so.
Right, but this literally contained Nazi content, copies of Der Stürmer, the anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda newspaper. It contains organizing tools, training manuals, recruitment videos, manifestos, and it's just all sitting there waiting for people to use and tap into. And
exactly.
Interesting. So what can people do to try and get this stuff down from there? What is it? Is it going through the Congress people in California? Is it a federal thing?
I think political pressure at all levels is a really important element in terms of countering the impact of the Internet Archive and other sites online that are allowing this content to propagate. I think when it comes from multiple angles, whether that be federal, state, local, that can be very, very effective in pressuring companies to take action, particularly in the likes of California's situation, companies based in California receiving pressure from the Californian government can be a very, very effective strategy. So I think political pressure is the one thing that can be done on our level to kind of get change in this area.
And I think groups like ours need to do a better job of raising awareness about things like that most people don't know even exist. Shifting to the Jew hatred of these groups, I would assume Jew hatred is core to their ideologies. What can you tell us about this? What sort of threat do they pose to the Jewish people?
It's a very significant threat. I think, anti-Semitism generally and Jew hatred is core in the ideology of these groups, whether it be from, white supremacist, anti-government, neo-Nazi, right across the board. It always comes back to anti-Semitism, and that's there at the very, very center of this ideology. Even those conspiratorial ideologies like QAnon, those conspiracies can be brought back to a core anti-Semitism there as well. In terms of the threat that is presented, I mean, you just have to look at the uptick in anti-Semitic violence over the last few years to see the growing threat that these groups present. We're seeing continued attacks on synagogues and places of worship. We're also seeing continued rhetorical attacks and vandalism increasing in Jewish neighborhoods across the United States as well. There's a couple of groups who are regularly targeting these communities, these neighborhoods, these places of worship, with flyers, with graffiti, which link back to these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and promote violence against Jewish communities as well. So that's something which is really, really concerning. I think also something that we're seeing is that whenever anything happens in the world that these groups don't like, they will always pin it back on Jews and on the Jewish community. It always comes back to this anti-Semitic idea. So, whenever we talk about the Ukraine war, or we talk about even natural disasters or the train crash in East Palestine in Ohio, these are constantly being blamed on Jews and on the Jewish community and are being used to incite violence against those communities.
Right. And one thing you hear a lot from these groups is about the Zog conspiracy. For people that don't know, that's the Zionist occupation government or Zionist occupied government, sometimes also referred to as the Jewish occupational government. What can you tell us about this conspiracy theory that posits that Jews secretly are in control of the governments of the Western world?
Yeah, well, you've hit it pretty much right on the head there. The Zog idea is the idea that either through direct involvement or through influence, policy at the federal level in the United States and at the international governmental level as well, is being influenced by Jews and by influential Jews. And this is being linked into things like Jeffrey Epstein conspiracy theories, and we see one of the groups that we follow produces flyers which label every element of the current administration or every element of the CDC as being Jewish. They like to believe that the government is entirely controlled by Jewish or Israeli influence. And that again is used to encourage their anti-Semitism, encourage their anti-government extremism, and encourage incitement to violence in both cases as well.
Right. So it's almost like the protocols of the Elders of Zion is that they've taken that mantle and infused it into their work these days. Exactly.
And so much of this goes back to the likes of the protocols, to the likes of the Nazi regime and the use of anti-Semitism in terms of delegitimizing the Weimar government and delegitimizing various different governments as well. These ideas find their roots there and have propagated and have spread here in the United States and around the world since then.
Right. And that actually it makes an interesting question. What are sort of like the roots of this, like historically? Is it starting with the Nazis, or I guess maybe before that, the Russians? Like, where is that white supremacist? When does that sort of start?
Well, it goes back a long way beyond the Nazis. And I think, whenever we look at white supremacism and anti-Semitism, you've got to look back into even the 19th century. Right. In terms of the emergence of some of these ideas. We saw this with the Russians. We saw the creation of this idea of Judeo-Bolshevism when the Russian Revolution was happening in 1917, and then as we moved into the the Weimar era and the emergence of the Nazi Party in Germany, as well as similar movements in the United Kingdom, right across Europe and France, and even here in the United States, you're seeing the conflation of white supremacy with anti-Semitism. Even the KKK in the United States at that point in time were organizing around this kind of anti-Semitic idea, the use of the term of Zog, or the Zionist-occupied government there. So these ideas really began to conflate at that point, and then from there, we moved into the 20th century and obviously to where we are today.
Right. And you mentioned a little bit about the Great Replacement theory, which is something I think a lot of people have heard about now. When the white nationalists marched in Charlottesville, they were chanting, "The Jews should not replace us." What can you tell us about this theory and the idea that the Jews are the #1 enemy of the white man?
Yeah, so the Great Replacement theory, it all really comes down to the idea that the white population is being replaced through the idea of white genocide, or through outbreeding, or sort of through immigration as well. This ideology has a few different iterations and a few different kind of versions, but all of them come down to the idea that this is being orchestrated or controlled by Jewish interests. Again, it links to that Zionist-occupied government idea, which says that the Zionist-occupied government wants to eradicate whiteness. It wants to eradicate the white population by encouraging mass migration from outside the United States or Europe, as well as encouraging declining birth rates among the white population. That's why you've got the likes of the Christchurch shooter in New Zealand, who said in his manifesto, "It's the birth rates, it's the birth rates, it's the birth rates."
Right.
That's central to those ideas. The idea that the white population is being replaced, and it's being used to incite direct violence, like we saw in Christchurch.
Right. So I want to talk briefly about another attack, which was the Poway Synagogue shooting in San Diego in 2019. The perpetrator, John Ernst, considered himself a European and Christian. And in his manifesto, this was really like the heart of the attack, that he was slaying evil in the name of Jesus. His manifesto stated, you can't love God if you do not hate Satan. You can't love righteousness if you do not also hate sin. You can't love your own race if you're not going out to try and destroy those people that are trying to destroy your race. In his mind, there's essentially no option but to kill Jews, lest his friends be destroyed by Jews. So what can you tell us about this ideology that seems to share with a lot of these people that are carrying out these attacks, like the attack in Christchurch, where it really seems to me that white supremacy is almost like just Christian fanaticism or Christian fundamentalism in a sense?
Yeah, it's very interesting, because there, again, like I keep going back to that, this is a very varied space and a very, very wide issue. And there are differing ideas on this across that spectrum. At the core, though, I think the idea of what was said by John Ernest, the perpetrator of the Poway synagogue shooting, is the idea that love and hate are two sides of the same coin. And the idea, and it's used rhetorically by neo-Nazis to kind of soften their message in many cases, the idea that they don't hate other people, they just love themselves. They love the white race, and they will do whatever it takes to preserve the white race. So that kind of idea of love being used to justify violence is deeply ingrained in this movement, and it allows people to radicalize to the point of violence. In terms of the idea of it being sort of a Christian fanaticism or Christian extremism, that's certainly an element in many of these cases. However, many of these groups are deeply divided on the issue of Christianity. We've actually seen a lot of discourse recently talking about how Christianity is quote unquote Jewish. So again, they will call everything that they don't like Jewish. We see many of these groups actually resorting to either Norse paganism or even esoteric Nazism, which views Hitler as their deity, which is a very, very sort of twisted ideology that is created a religion out of this, out of Nazi ideas. But yeah, there's definitely that element of sort of a fanaticism, a Christian fanaticism that many of these shooters, such as John Ernest, have. Obviously, we've also seen in the case of Dylan Roof that Christian communities are being targeted by, these ideologies as well. So it's a very varied space when it comes to religion, and it's a big question that is kind of raised a lot in these spaces online.
Interesting. Yeah, his manifesto, it was, as you mentioned earlier, the Jews were both the communist Marxists, and also he wanted to attack them because they were the capitalists running the banks. And,
Mhm.
he had a whole litany of charges from running slavery to promoting race mixing. So I guess it's a very fungible sort of ideology. And I guess at heart, maybe it does not always make sense, but the heart of it is, I guess, white domination. And somehow the Jews are infiltrating and affecting the race through a number of different methods.
Absolutely. This is a space that's full of contradictions, a few of which you've just highlighted. There are many, many more contradictions like this, things that don't make sense on the surface. And at the end of the day, what we have to remember is this all comes back to justifying their hatred. Justifying the hatred of Jews, their hatred of people of color, the hatred of the LGBTQ community, and their promotion of white supremacist ideas, and ultimately their end goal of creating a white ethno-state, and in many cases the elimination of anyone that doesn't fit their model of whiteness.
Right. And how educated are some of these leaders of these groups? I mean, are there like professors, doctors that are in charge of some of these groups? Or is this, I don't know, some just people angry that their lot in life and, their economic place in America?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of, I think, misconceptions popularly about who is a white supremacist and who could be a neo-Nazi. And you're right in saying that, yeah, many of the leaders of these groups are, they do have PhDs, they do have positions in universities. They one of the main ideologues of the 20th century when it comes to neo-Nazism, William Pierce, was a PhD. And held positions in universities. He was a physics professor, I believe. Similarly, we have many of the neo-Nazis today who are writing for the blogs and producing a lot of the ideas that are being used by these groups are very well educated and very eloquent, and in many cases are very well connected. That's why we're seeing think tanks emerging. That are completely white supremacist. You had to look at Richard Spencer's movement a few years ago to see many of those people and those voices in those spaces who were well educated and who were very eloquent and were able to make these ideas make sense to their intended audience. But broadly speaking, aside from the core being whiteness, there really is no set demographic for neo-Nazis and white supremacists, and it covers the entirety of society, and that's why I think this poses such a threat today, and the internet has really, really helped push that forward.
Right. Now let's turn to white nationalist groups and Palestinian militant collaboration, which I think people may find interesting. Infamously, many leaders of the Palestinian community supported Hitler and the Nazis during World War II with their sort of joint desire to eradicate Jews. If people don't know, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem back then, Haji al-Husseini, infamously made a visit to Berlin to visit Hitler at the height of the war. And unfortunately today, there is once again an affinity by these neo-Nazis for Palestinian groups such as Hamas. We also see in some Palestinian protests in the West Bank and Gaza, for instance, Palestinians waving and burning swastikas. On the white nationalist front, you have National Party co-chairman Gregory Conti in a message in Arabic to the Arabic world, stating we must cooperate and fight in our common struggle against the Jews. So how closely is the connection between neo-Nazi groups and Palestinian groups? And don't these groups also hate Muslims and Arabs as well? Or is Jews like the common enemy that sort of must be focused on and taken care of first?
Yeah, well, to address the first part of your question, the relationship or the support for Palestinian groups from neo-Nazis, it ebbs and flows. When attacks happen in Israel, or jihadist attacks happen in even Europe or the United States, we see increases and upticks in support, at least rhetorically, for these groups from neo-Nazis online. Many of them promote the idea of using Islamist or jihadist terrorism to advance their own, hopes of a race war. So there's that kind of ebb and flow of when things are happening in the Middle East or in Europe. We see a lot more neo-Nazis talking about it. Critically, also, we've seen neo-Nazis adopting the aesthetics of what they call white jihad, and the promotion of ideas like white Sharia. So we've seen them using many of the aesthetics used by the likes of Hamas and Hezbollah, using the iconography of those groups to promote alliance, etc. Particularly accelerationists, particularly those groups who want to see chaos and want to see the fall of society. They see a potential alliance there as being something that could help bring forward that kind of race war that they're hoping for. I will say that in many cases, this is a bit of a one-way street. When we talk about that rhetorical support, many of these groups who are supporting the Taliban, who are supporting Hamas and Hezbollah, are not receiving support back.
Right.
You know, I think it's fair to say that there's not much in terms of actual communication between them at this point in time. However, the example you raise of Gregory Conte, who you know, put out that message in almost perfect Arabic, shows that there is a willingness among some of these people to actually really reach out and promote direct cooperation. We've also, you know, tracked a couple of podcasts and live streams over the past 12 to 24 months in which we do have representatives from Palestinian groups, and in one case, an Iranian jihadist talking to white supremacists from around the world, you know, including those here in the United States, and talking about potential common ground. And you're right in saying that that common ground is their anti-Semitism. I think at the end of the day, the core of neo-Nazi ideology, as I've said, is anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, and ultimately this exterminationist impulse that they have. And they see the threat to Israel from jihadist and Islamist groups as being kind of a really, really important tool for them in terms of challenging the Jewish community globally from both sides, both here in the United States and in the Middle East as well.
Right. And there was a member of the Minnesota Boogaloo movement who was arrested on charges of trying to work with Hamas and raise money for them. So it's really, you know, there may be, as you're saying, sort of like ulterior motives here. Perhaps they believe Jews are the weakest when people are attacking Israel and just sort of using Israel as a leverage point, you know. So how are they stoking the flames here? And you also talk about, I just want to, something also mentioned was the race war, this idea of like eventually like causing chaos for this race war. Can you also talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So many of these groups rely on the idea of a race war as being their ultimate goal, fomenting societal, you know, discordance and I guess conflict to the point of there being a physical civil war between the races, between white people and people of color, in which ultimately they view white people coming out on top and being able to form their own ethno-state. This relies on an idea called accelerationism, which is essentially an ideology which promotes random acts of violence as a way of destabilizing society and pushing society towards an eventual conflict like that race war we talked about through a collapse, essentially. So when they're supporting groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and even ISIS, what they are doing is they're hoping that the acts of violence perpetrated by these groups will destabilize society further on a global level, and give them opportunities to engage in conflict and to see out that kind of fantasy of a race war and a white ethno-state.
Right. So essentially, like, they would love to see Israel enter another war and become World War III. And I guess their vision is that somehow the white people will rise up and win that war.
Exactly. That's their vision. I think for European groups and for North American groups, the vision is the expulsion or extermination of all non-white people, and through the process of this war, and then the creation of white ethno-states within those spaces. So that is their ultimate goal. In many cases, they're very open about this. You hear many of these groups using the phrase, race war now, or Rahowa, which is racial holy war. And that language of all-out global warfare and white supremacy is really central to these movements.
And so a lot of people on the webinar live in California. I think many would actually find it surprising that the state is actually a big hub of white supremacy. Why California, and what sort of localized threat are we facing here?
Well, one thing we always say is that there's no state in which this stuff doesn't exist. California has become a big hub for it. I think that's largely because of the size of California, and also because just of the diversity that is there in that state, and the diversity which makes California so great is something that's resented by many of these white supremacists within California. We actually have seen a number of groups recently really doubling down in California. We saw one group in Danville, just in the Bay Area, I believe, who were threatening synagogues in the area, and doxed and harassed the rabbis in that synagogue, posting their personal identifying information online, and sort of promoting violence against those rabbis. So that's the kind of threat we're looking at in California. We also see the emergence of organized white supremacist gangs in California, labeling themselves as, active clubs or various different names that they use for their groups. These tend to be very localized, pretty well organized, and connected to a broader national and even international network. And that's definitely something which is cause for concern, because they tend to operate on that local level, to present a very real threat towards Jewish communities and communities of color within those spaces.
Right. And one very active group in California, which has got a lot of attention lately, is the Goyim Defense League, which you mentioned a little bit, and their group's leader, John Medeo, I believe his name is. They are, for people that don't know, behind the anti-Semitic leaflets being thrown on people's lawns across the city, now across the country, and they're the ones hanging the banners on freeway overpasses. What can you tell us about this organization, like when they started, what sort of threat do they pose, and why they can't be arrested for this sort of behavior?
Yeah, so they are a very, very active group who have been growing almost exponentially over the past 2 years, maybe a little longer than that. John Minadeo was based in the Bay Area in Petaluma, California. He has now moved actually to Orlando. However, there's still a very, very significant presence in California of this group. They toe the line. They're very, very careful with not breaking laws relating to speech, not threatening violence, although sometimes members do slip up and do break laws when it comes to distributing those flyers and dropping their banners over highway overpasses. So they have a vast network that goes right across the country and now internationally as well. We actually saw John Minadeo make headlines last, I believe it was September, when he and one other affiliate of the group traveled to the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland and held up anti-Semitic signs there. They were actually arrested for that action. We also saw members of the group project anti-Semitic messaging onto the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. So we're seeing a growing international influence from this group that started in the Petaluma area. They are still, as I said, very, very active in California as well. And we often see them do this kind of real world activism, as it were, where they will turn up outside Jewish communities, synagogues, etc., and hold, demonstrations with megaphones loudly, spreading anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, racially and anti-Semitically abusing passersby. And I think most prominently recently, they traveled through Hollywood and West Hollywood in a rented U-Haul van, which was draped with anti-Semitic, racist, and homophobic messaging across the side, abusing people from that van. So that's the kind of action we're seeing them doing. They're incredibly public and incredibly prominent, and they really thrive on the media attention that this brings them. They regularly post streams online boasting about the local news coverage they're getting, or the national or even international news coverage they're getting, and the people behind it are very narcissistic and really want this attention on them, as they believe that's a way to get their message out there further.
And do you think that group in particular poses any physical violent threats, or are they more rabble rousers, sort of trolling the Jewish community?
Well, one of the tactics of the white supremacist movement broadly is that kind of differentiation between, whether it be a political or a public arm, and then a more militant wing that lies under the surface. We've seen this in Scandinavia, in Germany, and here in the United States as well. And the GDL, or the Ground Defense League, are a really good example of this happening in the United States. The prominent public members of the group regularly, denounce acts of violence. They distance themselves from acts of violence. However, whenever acts of violence do happen, it's not uncommon to see their flyers, their materials in the possession of the perpetrators, particularly when it comes to vandalism. They did a tour in Texas last year, and were protesting outside of synagogues in Austin. And then the next day, there was a firebomb attack on one of those synagogues in Austin. Right. And it is not confirmed, but widely believed that it was a GDL affiliate, at least, or a supporter who perpetrated that attack. So that's key to how these groups operate. The right. Public side, in order to avoid censorship, avoid prosecution, distance themselves from the violence, but the supporters, the affiliates, and the members will engage in violence, and there's always a risk of violence there from members of these groups.
Right. I think that we see that a lot of times in anti-Semitism in general, where people debate whether it's more dangerous in the right or the left. The right, usually it is these physical attacks. Left, it's an ideology, it's a thought. And I guess, right, a group like the Ground Defense League, while they may not be creating or conducting violent attacks, they're spreading an ideology where you get these lone wolves and radicalized other people. But just one last question from my end, then we're going to go to some audience questions. Just to briefly touch on Europe, your materials show there are many international groups, as you mentioned, in Europe. In Germany, I've been reading the papers where the reports of literally neo-Nazis and high-level commands in the army. What sort of threat are we seeing in Europe in general? And could these racist nationalist movements literally return to power in Germany? Is that a possibility ever?
I think that's always a possibility, and that's something that we really do have to consider as a possibility now, probably more than at any point since the Second World War. You're right in saying that high-level members of the army, not only in Germany but in France as well, were found to believe in neo-Nazism, white supremacism, and accelerationism. And you just have to look at the likes of Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, even Greece, to see how neo-Nazis are capitalizing on sort of broader societal fears. They're capitalizing on conflicts that are emerging to promote their ideas and to find political foothold and to try and push forward their ideas on a national level. Something else we're really concerned about when it comes to Europe is returning foreign fighters from Ukraine. We see many neo-Nazis traveling to Ukraine to fight alongside sort of more neo-Nazi inclined groups, whether that be right sector or the Misanthropic Division, which are two kind of neo-Nazi volunteer divisions that are fighting in that country currently. We're concerned about many of these foreign fighters returning to their homelands, whether that be Germany, Poland, France, Spain, Italy, with combat experience, with international and national connections, and potentially even with smuggled weaponry. And that will present a threat moving forward. That's something that we are deeply concerned about, from that violence perspective. So I think, yeah, the threat to Europe is both political and it's got that violent element as well. So that's something we're deeply concerned about moving forward.
Oh, sorry, you touched on Ukraine briefly, just because I know there's a sort of like the Russian conspiracy propaganda that all Ukrainians are white nationalist neo-Nazis. I mean, that's just a lot of nonsense, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something, I think which the Russians have been very, very good at is propagating that idea. And we actually saw one neo-Nazi from the United States who did travel to Ukraine and fought alongside Ukrainian soldiers, and he was wearing face tattoos, and the Russians put him on national media, and they use these small examples, and they amplify these small examples to justify their aggression in Ukraine, and that the kind of their own imperialist endeavor there. broadly speaking, that we also are tracking a lot of neo-Nazis who are on the Russian side and are fighting for the Russians within Ukraine, such as, members of the Wagner group and the Rosich battalion as well. So it's definitely a narrative that has been used by Putin's government, by the Russians, to justify their aggression in Ukraine. And obviously there's very little truth to that when you talk about the macro level.
And you have a Jewish president, and the former prime minister before the current one was also a Jew. It was actually the first time in history that a country had a Jewish president and prime minister besides Israel. So going to the questions, how closely is the government monitoring these groups? And here, just to combine another one, has law enforcement or Jewish organizations been able to infiltrate these groups? I'm assuming at some level.
Yeah, so when the first half of that question, in terms of how closely law enforcement is looking at these groups, we know that whenever there's any suggestion of illegality, we're providing stuff to law enforcement, and they are actively tracking a number of these groups here in the United States, and doing what they can to prevent illegality from happening, prevent that violence from occurring as well. In terms of infiltration, that's something that we have, you hear about, and I presume there is some level of that, but often that's very, very hard to know.
And then talking about what can be done to push back on white supremacy, someone's asking, is there any kind of preventable measures that can be taken before these groups take action? And what can, all of us do?
Yeah, well, I think, one thing that is important to say is that groups like ours, groups like MEMRI, who are monitoring these groups online, that's a really, really important element in terms of pushing back and in terms of preventing escalation to the point of violence, monitoring their chatter when it comes to, these online spaces where they're communicating with one another, and they are, planning their actions, whether it be protests, demonstrations, or even violent attacks, is a really, really important role. So support that groups like ours can get is really, really important. I'll also say one of the most important things we can do is remove the infrastructure of hate. Do what we can to undercut the spaces in which these groups are operating, whether that be putting pressure on platforms to remove these groups, whether that be to put pressure on the likes of Cloudflare and other groups who are companies hosting these websites, or even, taking a look at the online stores, fundraising of these groups, take a look at their situation in terms of taxes and stuff like that is something that MEMRI is looking into, and whether there are laws being broken that can be used to kind of limit these groups in terms of their ability to fundraise as well. Last year we put out a major report on white supremacy use of cryptocurrency, and how many cryptocurrency platforms have allowed these groups and ideas to proliferate. So I think putting pressure in these different sectors to undercut that infrastructure of hate is probably the most effective thing we can do.
And have they turned to cryptocurrency? That was another question here. Have white supremacist groups really turned to that to try and evade the government?
For sure. Yeah, we definitely have seen a lot of groups turning to cryptocurrency, particularly before the cryptocurrency crash of last year. Whenever a lot of the cryptocurrencies were doing a little bit better, we saw many of these groups switching to Bitcoin, Ethereum, and probably most prominently Monero, which is a cryptocurrency they use, which kind of emphasizes privacy even more, and it's kind of marketed as a completely untraceable cryptocurrency. So most of the fundraising that we're seeing is taking place using crypto now, because it's got this veneer of untraceability, this veneer of privacy, and while that's not always the case, and authorities are pretty much always able to track down who's sending what where, it's definitely an idea that many of these groups have latched onto. Many are also promoting the idea of a parallel economy, and kind of detaching from the broader, banking system, and creating their own parallel economy there, using their own currencies, their own versions of different softwares like PayPal, etc. So that's something which, money is everything to these groups, and that's how they operate. So that's something we're monitoring closely, and needs to be eyes need to be kept on that.
Right. Unfortunately for these groups, right, authorities are capable of tracking down cryptocurrency. Israel's done it with Hamas. I know America's done it. It's not as secure as some people may think it is. And actually, speaking of Hamas, people were interested, and I actually have a pamphlet from you. Do you have in PDF form? And I can maybe send out the link when we send a follow-up. People have, two people have questions on, do we have a report and data on this sort of infatuation between neo-Nazi groups and Hamas? Is that a report that you guys actually put out that I can link people to?
We do have that report. Now, in most cases, our reports are primarily for law enforcement audiences, but we have redacted versions which we send out to broader audiences. And anybody who is interested in reading those can certainly reach out to me or to MEMRI as an organization, and we can provide that information. And we also have email lists and stuff like that where we can share a lot of our research findings via those.
Okay, I'll try and get that for everybody. I was literally reading, it's a pretty thick document that details a lot of the sort of people that I was talking to earlier, and there's a lot more in there of these groups that sort of have this infatuation with Hamas and the Islamic Jihad groups. Here's another one. I would like to hear what you think about the proposition that extreme right popularity activity is in part a reaction to the extreme left sort of progressive activist community what we're seeing now.
Yeah, I think that is a line that is quite often propagated by many of these groups themselves. They talk about being sort of anti-woke is the terminology they use,
right,
or whatever, and quite often we've seen that these groups can and do operate in vacuums. These ideas do emerge. White supremacy has always existed in political context, throughout the last 100 to 150 years. So I don't think that those are necessary conditions for the emergence of white supremacist or neo-Nazi ideas. But I think that these groups do very intentionally use broader societal discontentment as an excuse or as an environment in which they can become more public with their activism, and it gives them kind of this veneer of legitimacy that they can claim, that kind of gives them space to propagate their ideas. We saw in 2020 during the sort of unrest in the summer there, many groups really latching on to the Black Lives Matter movement as something to oppose, and something to, groups that had existed prior to that summer suddenly became a lot more popular as they kind of latched onto those ideas, used those hashtags, etc., to promote their idea. So I would say that these groups can exist within a vacuum, but they do use opposing political ideas to
sort of fan the flames and
exactly
indoctrinate and I guess to activate and engage people, obviously probably twisting a lot of things that are actually said for their own purposes. Two more quick questions. One, the ADL recently, there was sort of a threat that it was going to be, I don't remember, White Supremacy Day or a day of rage and hate, and that didn't happen. And apparently it was just some small group in Idaho that put out a Telegram message. Sort of maybe tell us a little bit what happened there with that day of hate that never happened, but also I guess the idea of overreacting, like the Goyim Defense League, sort of overreacting to anything that's out there versus real threats that we really need to be concerned about.
Yeah, and this is one of the hardest things when it comes to our job and when it comes to the broader societal level. One of the hardest things is discerning what is a legitimate threat and what is not. Right. In many cases, people, talk a big game and then nothing happens. That white supremacist day of hate, I think in that case, there was a network of groups. We tracked that very, very closely. There was a network of groups. There was, Iowa, Idaho, New York, and one other location, which I can't remember. I think California, actually.
Right.
We're communicating and we're talking about this International Day of Hate. However, in advance of that, in the days leading up to it, the Chicago Police Department and the New York Police Department both put out statements warning communities about it, warning that they would be taking a hardline approach to any activities that broke the law relating to this day of hate. And I think that scared a lot of these groups. And I think that kind of thing is very, very effective in terms of combating these plans when they're being talked about. As you said, when it comes to the likes of the GDL and other groups like that, which are very public, it's never safe to say that violence isn't possible coming from these groups. It's never safe to say, oh, it's just talk, or this is all rhetorical, because there's always the possibility of violence. And similarly, sometimes violence can seemingly come completely out of a vacuum. Many of the mass shooters that we've seen, many of the white supremacist terrorists that we've seen, leave very little trail before they embark upon their sort of violent actions in whatever form that might be. So I think just constantly monitoring and making sure that we're staying on top of these spaces online is really, really, really important element of combating groups and preventing violence.
Right. And then one last one. In the wake of the Kanye West anti-Semitic tirades, the slogan, "Ye is right, change my mind," has been gaining traction with extremist circles. Why would they pick up a slogan from someone from the Black community like this?
I think a key, it's something that, they've really, really pushed in the past few months. And I think a key part of this is, again, this sort of veneer of legitimacy that they grasp for. And they believe that if they can promote the idea of a sort of anti-Semitic alliance with, whether it be Black nationalists, other Black anti-Semites, they can promote the idea of the world against Jews, right? Of creating an alliance that, crosses racial boundaries with this one united enemy. We talked about, obviously, the attempted alliances with, jihadist and Islamist groups as well. It's all part of the same impulse. It's all part of that same idea of trying to portray the ultimate enemy as the Jews, and trying to create an alliance which can be kind of used to promote that further violence and to promote the expulsion or extermination of Jews from the United States. So there's no surprise there that many people use the "Ye is right" hashtag in order to build that broader alliance there.
Well, we're at time. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this great discussion, eye-opening discussion, important discussion. To keep updated on all our work and all our events, please visit ccfpeace.com, ccfpeace.com. That's where you can also donate so we can bring you these great conversations. Simon, please let everyone know where they can find your work and find you on social media.
Absolutely, yeah. I can be found on Twitter primarily by searching Dr. Simon Purdue. That's where I'll share much of my work. I can also be caught on email at spurdue@memri.org if you get any questions about our work here at MEMRI, or if you want to request any of our work there as well, or find out how to support our work. You can always email me there.
Great. And MEMRI is a great organization doing very important work, not only in white supremacy, but a lot of the stuff in the extremist groups in Israel, exposing hate there. So we hope to see everyone soon. In the meantime, please stay safe. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Take care.
Thanks.